Thank you. Good morning, and welcome to this webinar, 5 Ways to Improve the Quality and Value of Sales Enablement Content. In the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to cover topics of both strategic and tactical value. We'll help you create a better plan for your sales enablement processes, and we will give you some great information that you can use immediately when you finish the webinar. We're very lucky to have several well-renowned speakers from the world of sales enablement today. Marisa Kopec leads SiriusDecisions Product Marketing and Management Service, delivering research and advice to help product marketers and managers succeed. James Ninivaggi is an analyst for SiriusDecisions Sales Optimization Service, providing information and insight that helps organizations improve sales performance and drive ROI. Marisa and Jim's comments will be interspersed with examples from Jim Maliski, who leads Launch International's Strategic Services practice. Jim leverages his experience with sales enablement, best practices, and content strategy consulting to help Launch International clients develop selling tools that help push opportunities through the pipeline and grow revenue. By the way, we will be live tweeting during the session, so let us know your thoughts both during and before and after the webinar. Look for us at LaunchINTL and using hashtags LaunchINTL and 5 Ways Webinar. Plus, over in our sales enablement content group that we run at LinkedIn, we're starting a new discussion for live conversation during the webinar and then follow-up and consideration afterwards. We'll also be running polling questions during the webinar, and we'll announce the results over both Twitter and LinkedIn. So with no further delay from me, I'll turn the wheel over to Marisa and Jim from SiriusDecisions.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Let's start with looking at what's going on in organizations today. If we could move the slide. Today, let's talk about what 10, 15 years ago with regards to content. Back in the day, and back when I was managing marketing communication for a large organization, we used to print everything. It showed up in boxes, and we shipped it out to offices all around the world. And what managed our content inventory was cost and resource, because it was expensive to do those sorts of things. If we could move on to the internet or email, and then marketing automation as well, and then as all of the technology grew and grew, and expanded our capability to create content without spending any money per se and not having to ship it anywhere, we could easily build what we wanted to and create what we wanted to. What ultimately happened was the creation of this, the content monster. And this is the situation that exists in B2B organizations today. It's a beast. And so if in your organization your salespeople and your channel partners are overwhelmed with content, there's a lot of noise, they're not using it, they don't know what to use, they don't know how to find it, this is a problem that exists, and many organizations are focusing on this as one of their key initiatives in this year and moving forward in 2012. So we're going to share with you, Eric, if you'd move to the next slide, some of the best practices and trends we're seeing going on to tackle that beast. And that is looking at the ownership of content, from content creators to the syndicators of content, looking at governance and processes within organizations. Also thinking about who the content's for, taking an inventory and mapping of your content. And we see mapping, we'll get into that later, but mapping to how customers buy. Also looking at a gap analysis. When you do an inventory and you have a good assessment of the content that exists, it also gives you visibility into what doesn't exist, what you should have, and we'll go through that. And then finally, we'll talk about measurement.
Very good. We go on to the next slide. By the way, that was Marisa, for those of you who may not be sure. This is Jim Ninivaggi. And just, thinking of that sales, that content monster, I think back on my own experience selling in New York City in the 90s. We actually had a physical sales closet. And you'd go in the morning and you would pick, the collateral and stuff that you needed for that day's calls. And we had maybe 30 pieces of content to choose from. And, it's not uncommon for us to talk with clients today who have content portals that are absolutely overloaded. They'll have 30, 40, even 50,000 pieces of content. And you just have to scratch your head and wonder, how can a salesperson find what they need when there's that much to choose from? So we go to the next slide. We're going to start with since our topic is around, sales enablement content, it would be good for us to start, I think, in defining exactly what sales enablement is, because what we find is that different sales organizations have slightly different definitions of what sales enablement actually is. And if you look at that upper left-hand picture there, that salesperson shaking the hand of that prospect or customer, you can really encapsulate what the definition of enablement is in that photograph. And then basically you can think of it anytime one of our salespeople is sending an email or leaving a voicemail or knocking on the door of a prospect or customer, that they have the process, the skills, and the knowledge to make the most of that interaction and optimize that interaction. Now, to date, if we look at those three pillars, process, skills, and knowledge, they have been, typically been in the realm of disparate organizations. For process, it's basically been the realm of sales operations, things like opportunity management and forecast process. On the skills side, that's been the realm of sales training. So we're talking, face-to-face selling skills, negotiation skills, presentation skills. And knowledge has been primarily the realm of product marketing, product management, and sales communications. When we look at content, we look at content playing really a critical role across all those three pillars, but primarily in the area of knowledge. And we look at content as helping in the transfer of knowledge that is required for salespeople to be successful, and carrying that transfer of knowledge from the sales rep to the customer. If we go to the next slide, and looking at the traditional sales organization that's existed to date, you've had these, again, disparate organizations. You've got sales training, sales operations, sales communications on one side, all delivering content to our salespeople. On the other side, we've got product marketing, product management, we've got field marketing, and they're delivering content to the salespeople. And if we click onto our next slide, the role of sales enablement ultimately is to play an integrator role. And and the role of sales enablement, especially if we look at it from a content perspective, is to assemble that content, integrate that content, filter that content so that reps aren't being overloaded, and then monitoring that content, both for usage and for value. And that's really where, and for the rest of our discussion for our webcast, that's what we're going to be focusing on, is how we can leverage content as we look to better enable our salespeople.
This is Jim Maliski, the other Jim from Launch International. And one of the things that a lot of our clients struggle with is really trying to figure out where that leadership can live within the organization. Since it spans so many different parts of the firm, that leadership can live in sales training or sales operations, but it can also be in marketing or in the product marketing or solutions marketing group. Our point of view is that the more important question that you should be asking is who's involved in the process, not just who leads it. Now, the best companies we work with have done a great job of assembling a team. You can call it an effectiveness team, a content effectiveness team, or even a sales enablement team that's got different members from different parts of the organization. And they really work together and try and avoid the finger pointing that might have gone on in the past, where one team blames the other team for content not being good, or one team says salespeople aren't using the content. Getting everyone pointed in the same direction is a really important thing. One of the clients we work with is a large IT services firm that's been working on this for the last 6 or 7 months, and they've had phenomenal success doing it. Their head of sales enablement came from the marketing organization, but she did a great job of getting buy-in from folks in the sales operations teams as well as the product marketing teams. And they started small. They're working on a few key sales tools, and one of the things that they've done is they've gotten great executive sponsorship, but they're also constantly reaching out to the field and saying, this is the content we're working on, what do you think? So they're always getting feedback from the people that are going to be ultimately using the tools.
All right, so all of you out there are involved in this process in one way or another. Maybe you're a content creator, maybe you're responsible for the distribution of the content, maybe you're a receiver of the content. And so as we think about content, for those of you who have been in marketing roles in the past, well, how did we define the audience from a marketing perspective? When we looked at our customer base, what did we do? Segmentation, looking at specific verticals, customer segments, really trying to get very narrow and precise in terms of who we were targeting and how we were communicating to those targets. What happens in the B2B internal world? One size fits all. And the sales communication, the sales training, and anything sales enablement tends to be for sales. Mm-hmm. And so what we encourage you to do as a best practice is take all of that methodology and that way of thinking about your audience that you apply to your customers externally and turn it around and apply it to your sales force. Think about your salespeople as customers, and that's kind of cliche, but really think about them in terms of an audience segment and figure out within that sales organization and channel partner organizations that you work with, what are the personas that we're going to be engaging with, creating awareness, inspiring, trying to get into the mindset of this audience. And that is the beginning step towards sales enablement and content, is truly to divide up that audience from direct sales, from indirect sales, from global accounts to your teleprospecting, your inside sales organization. They have very different needs. Your global account managers that are managing multi-million-dollar deals are highly customized, highly personalized, hands-on, one-on-one. And then when you're working with an inside sales organization that's on the phone all day, they need a lot of stuff all over the walls, a lot of cheat sheets, a lot of laminated things hanging up on the cubes, highly syndicated, high-volume content. They're hungry for content, and it can be very standardized. So as you think about those segments, and then even starting to track out your communications and content strategy from the perspective of a senior sales manager has very different needs than a new hire that has very different needs than the actual rep who's on the street.
Right.
They have absolutely different information needs and different buttons to push and different tools. And so you have to start really defining these very discreetly so that you can be relevant and on point with what you're going to quote, launch to them or engage them with.
Absolutely. And, if you think about it from a positioning perspective, looking beyond the rep to the markets that they serve, a lot of our clients are moving from being product-centric to solution-centric. We hear that all the time. But if I'm, looking to create content for somebody who's managing 3 or 4 global accounts, what a solution looks like to that account is going to be very different from what a solution is going to look like to a smaller mid-sized business that maybe my inside salespeople are selling to. So we want to look at it, we want to look at that content also in regards to the markets that they're serving, and also looking at it from, how we're going to deliver it. To your point, Marisa, if we look at an inside salesperson, they'll be sitting inside in the cubicle, right? So you can have those laminated sheets, you can have cheat sheets, and they can access stuff on their computers, right, as they're talking to customers without the customers actually seeing it. Not true when you're out with a field salesperson. And here, what we're seeing with field salespeople is the movement of content to being mobile. So looking at smartphones and tablet computers and delivering content that way.
So here's a really good example of what you were just talking to, Jim. This is a playbook, and we've heard a lot about playbooks. There's a lot of different definitions for what a playbook is. In our world, playbooks are really about trying to take a set of information bundled up, things like industry information, audience information, solution information, and putting that into a single document that you can provide to a certain type of seller. So these are really seller persona-driven documents. So the playbook for a global account sales team is going to look different than the playbook that you give to an inside sales rep. Now, to the point of mobility, these are designed to be clickable, even though they're really just PDF documents. So these can be loaded onto a tablet for that salesperson who's sitting outside of the meeting trying to review everything prior to that meeting, and they can be used on a desktop in a inside salesperson's cubicle. And the main thing here is that you want to make them as simple as possible, and having them clickable means that you can chunk up text. In other words, you can take a lot of text and break it up into multiple pages, so you're not overwhelming a salesperson with too much information. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a specific page that maps to a certain step in the sales process. One of the other things that you can do with these documents is really emphasize or reinforce the steps that salespeople should be going through. So this is the solution identification phase of a process, and it's showing what the salesperson should be doing, but it's also reminding the salesperson where the buyer should be in the process. So you're linking up both buying and selling activities, and you're reinforcing the goal that that seller is supposed to be going towards. The other thing is, when you're talking about personas, this also includes information that's targeted towards different buyer personas. So if you're trying to equip your salesperson to talk to an IT executive versus a financial audience, you can have that information listed here also, and you'll see that on the left-hand side there under Talk Tracks. So that you're making sure that the person is prompted for how to have that financial conversation versus a much more in-depth IT conversation versus a line of business conversation.
The third step in the process is then to inventory and audit your existing content assets that are in your organization today, both the ones that you know about on your intranets and portals and the ones you don't know about that are on the salesperson's desktop or in their folders. So it's about doing the inventory both with those existing assets and then also procuring from the salespeople what are kind of those black market assets that work really well that the salespeople created themselves, because those are going to help inform your content strategy moving forward. Let's move to the next slide, Eric, and do the first build. So my daughter's 9 years old, and I don't know if you've ever seen that Hoarders show on the Discovery Channel, but I really think that they should do a children's hoarder, because I don't know how her room can be so messy. If we could go to the first build, and it's a disaster. And I think about a messy closet or her room, which no matter what I do continues to expand in mess. And it's about looking at all this mess of content, and at the first level, taking an inventory, throwing out what you don't use anymore, what's not being used, through looking at views and downloads and understanding sales usage, get rid of what's not being used, take the assets that are being highly leveraged, showcase them in the center of the closet, make those very easy to find, put the spotlight on those, and organize your closet in a way that the folks can find it. And having a central location, I'm amazed at how many organizations haven't even centralized the location of content into one place so that salespeople can access it. And that's really the first step through inventory and audit, is getting all of that content just consolidated and on one platform. If we can go to the next slide. Then once you realize, and have an inventory of what you have, then you have to understand what are the content types and do an assessment in terms of what's the quality, what's the relevance, is this a highly influential piece, what's the value. So here we propose some of the criteria to make that evaluation, but ultimately you can keep it even simple. You want to know date, you want to know location of the content, content type, and also do some assessment on a ranking of some sort, because what you really want to do is start cutting down those thousands to hundreds, and even realistically less than that. So this is very much a rationalization process.
Yeah, we recommend to our clients, when they're looking to audit their content, start small. Don't try to tackle. In my case, it would be a basement. I recently cleaned out my basement with my wife, and it was overwhelming. So we just focused on what we call the camping closet to begin with. But that's the same thing you want to do with your content in your sales portal. Is pick maybe a product or a customer segment, and then look at that content, again, whether it be white papers or presentations or video, against what we call QUIRVY. And that's quality, relevance, value, and influence. Quality, we want to look at, presentations in there. Are they using our current template? Do they have the right fonts? Videos. Are the videos of a high enough quality that really reflect the kind of quality that we want to project with our clients? From a relevance perspective, we want to ascertain whether or not this particular piece of content really truly is relevant to the audience it was intended to, and relevant to the the part of the sales process that we think that it'll be addressing. From a value perspective, value is in the eye of the reader or the consumer of that content. So we want to start to look at pieces of content and say, how much value would this have to a buyer? If I've got a in-depth research, heavy research white paper that basically walks them through an implementation process, that might have more value than, a glossy video that we have. And to our salespeople, what we want to then begin to coach them to do is maybe we hold off on those pieces of content that have a lot of value and use them later in the sales process where they can use them as leverage. And then lastly, from an influence perspective, and I think this is probably a new lens to look at content through, because content is playing a more important role in the buying process. Buyers are using content earlier in the process, before they engage a salesperson. They're using content throughout. So content is in some cases augmenting the conversation and dialogues our reps are having, and in other cases it's actually replacing those conversations. And then we have to look at content. Does this content not only create need for our category, but does it influence the buyer to look at our solution as opposed to our competitors?
And if this is overwhelming, if you are one of those companies that have 10,000 assets, you can start with a product line,
right,
a service area, a solution set. So it's one with hundreds versus thousands, and start small and build from it.
Next slide.
So as you can imagine, this can be a pretty sensitive topic. Imagine having to go and say that a bunch of content is not working, and go back to the author and say, hey, your content isn't good, you need to improve it. You can see that you could ruffle a lot of feathers. And the other thing you want to be careful of is that if you're not diplomatic about how you go about this, you can end up with a lot of finger pointing, where marketing is saying, no matter what we produce for sales, they're not using it, and sales is saying they never produce anything that really reflects how we sell. So one investment of your time that's going to pay off a lot is to upfront determine what criteria and come up with detailed criteria that you're going to use to evaluate content. This is an example for a large IT software company where we did a extract of content. To Jim's point, you don't necessarily have the time to look at all of it, but we did an extract of content, and we said that we're going to get everyone's agreement even before we start on what the criteria are going to be. In this case, it was really important to this company that the content was developed with a purpose. In other words, it was designed to help at a certain stage in the selling or buying process. And then once the purpose was determined, they also wanted to really say, is this useful in the way that it's supposedly been designed? You go to the next slide. Now, for the results, we mapped it on an effectiveness axis, which is the y-axis here. So all the little red discs you see there are all the different criteria that were now analyzed. And P means purpose, and U means usefulness. And you'll see that in some cases the content was scoring really high. But also, what we wanted to do is really figure out importance too, because if you think about improving content, you can't do everything on day one. You really have to prioritize what you're going to attack first. And one of the things this company really wanted to understand was what's important to the salesperson. So as a result of doing sales interviews, if you click on the next, we were able to identify that certain things are really, really important to the sales team. So U3 in the lower right-hand corner was a criterion that said, does the content describe how the offering fits into a bigger picture? In other words, if I'm creating a bunch of data sheets, if it just describes a product, does it say, hey, this product is part of a larger solution that you should really consider? And salespeople said that was really important, because instead of coming in and pushing a product, they really did want to have a higher level solution-driven conversation. So we were able to determine that the content wasn't scoring very high on that metric, but it was really, really important to the salespeople. So they were able to say that they really wanted to work on that as one of the first things to work on. Later in the week, we're going to be publishing a brief on how to do this, so stay tuned.
And we are going to pause right here to introduce our first poll question. Just use the polling question panel on the right-hand side here. And the question is, what was the result of your last internal audit of your existing sales tools? We've been doing some talking about auditing the quality and value and usability of sales tools. If you've done a sales tool review, we'd love to understand what kind of results you got. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we'll be letting you know the results over Twitter at LaunchINTL and 5 Ways webinar. And now we'll head back to Marisa and Jim.
Thank you. Step 4. And this, now that you have all the content inventoried, you've made an assessment in terms of the value that Jim discussed, the next step is to align and map that content to how your customers buy. And so what we're going to show here are the 6 stages of the Serious Decisions Customer Buying Cycle Framework. So, Eric, if you could build out this slide as I'm talking. And B2B buyers go through a purchasing decision process that is fairly standard and consistent across organizations and industries. There are a set of decision gates that the buyers go through to make a decision. And so this framework you're looking at right now shows those decision gates. The first decision gate is, we might have a problem or we're conceiving a vision. So this is when the unconscious moves into the conscious in an organization. There's an opportunity here, a new market, or there's a problem and the pain has gotten so bad, we've decided we're going to fix it. So now that you understand the problem, there's a commitment to change, and that's an actions taken in the organization, a budget line items created. Someone has been given the project or the initiative. That person or that team then goes out and explores possible solutions, alternatives to the problem, and looks for ways to solve the problem or capitalize on the opportunity. Once those alternatives, and that's not looking yet even at vendors, it's just looking at ways to solve it. Then it's looking at vendors and trying to understand which are the best vendors that will meet our needs. And so creating a short list and moving to the point of saying, this is how we're going to solve it, and here are the vendors that we'll consider. The next decision then is which vendor meets our needs the best, and which vendor will align to our requirements and deliver the best business value impact for our organization. Once that decision gate is passed through, now we get into the critical area of justifying the decision internally. And this is when sometimes your C-level decision makers move into the role, CFOs, etc., and the business case has to be presented and approved, and the funding is finalized. And then ultimately, the final inflection point of this purchasing decision process is actually choosing the vendor and making the selection. And as you can see, there's a cadence and a timing to this. And interestingly enough, this organically and very naturally aligns to sales processes that exist, your pipeline stages, and how your sales force automation tools are set up. So sales has this pretty well locked down in terms of the methodologies and the processes they use. But as content creators, we need to understand the buying cycle stages to start aligning the content and messaging we're creating for the buyer. And you can see on the bottom, we've created some suggestions in terms of where those content assets should sit. So after you do your inventory, the next step is to take essentially rows and columns in an Excel spreadsheet and start saying, all right, where do our content assets sit today? And you'll probably find, because this happens in most cases, guess what? You have a lot of content on the left. It's heavily weighted in the early stage of the buying process, and you have gaps and missing items, and you're much more lightweight on the middle and late stages of the buying process, because a lot of our content creation is fueled by demand generation and thought leadership needs and lead gen, and there's not much there. And so this is a tremendous opportunity, because ultimately best in class is having a balanced portfolio across every inflection point in the buying process. You want to make sure your content assets are balanced across the entire process.
And the next question, if we can go to our next slide, now this looks like the London Tube subway map. But if the next question is, so, how do we know what content our clients really, value? Getting back to, looking at assessing our content from that quality, relevance, value, and influence. What do they find valuable? Well, first and foremost, we are a research company, and so our clients are B2B companies, and they ask, what do B2B buyers, what content do they use and when do they use it in their buying process? And that's what you see here. So just to point out a couple of examples, you can see that blue line at the top, that represents white papers. And not surprising, you'd see white papers being of a lot of value early in the buying process, where those buyers are getting educated. They may be, trying to determine, hey, do I actually need to take action? Or if they've already passed, if they've committed to change, they may be in that phase where they're, trying to determine what the solution looks like. If we look at that orange slide, that's analyst reports. So again, you can see, buyers, B2B buyers, are going to be leveraging analysts late in their sales process, in their buying process. So when they come to that, decision justification phase that Marisa just talked about, well, that's where risk becomes very, very real to a buyer. Is this the latest and greatest technology? Is this vendor viable? Am I, locking myself into technology that might be obsolete in 2 years? And that's why they rely on analysts to help them alleviate some of that risk. And then lastly, if you look at that red line, peers. So interesting point about peers is that we see buyers looking to leverage their peer network early in their process, where they are looking at what should I be looking at, and what vendors might I be considering. It dips down in the middle of the process where they're heavy into that solution development and solution identification phase, and then it comes back up again. When that risk becomes very real and decision justification, they want to talk to their peers and say, okay, what experience have you had with these vendors? Do they deliver on the promises? And so this gives you an idea of when you're putting together and auditing your content and aligning it to the buying process, think about where buyers are going to be using that content and what they find of value and relevance based on where they are in their own process. Next.
So this is an example of a project we did for a project management software company. It was a really, really successful, and it was part of an initiative that resulted in a 43% revenue boost year over year. And one of the things that this company wanted to do was equip their salespeople to sell higher within the organization. So they did a great job of mapping the different buying stages and also identifying the key activities that would happen at every stage along the way. If you go to the next slide. And one of the things, and this is really to echo what Jim already mentioned, is that you really want to get inside the mind of your buyers at each of these stages. Early on, when a company is still considering committing to a change and not necessarily ready to commit to a solution, they might not be ready for your salesperson to come in and do a detailed solution pitch. In other words, they're still trying to get their arms around the problem. They're trying to understand some of the key issues. And one of the things you can do to help the buyer, but also position your salesperson as a trusted advisor, is to equip them to have a general conversation about the business problem, and that's what that whiteboard conversation is. This is a great example of a salesperson coming in and saying, we're not ready to talk to you about our solution in particular. What we want to do is talk to you about some of what companies in your peer group are doing around this business issue. So it's very much of a series of benchmarks and more of a high-level exploration of some of the key issues. Now, the nice thing about that is the buyer is going to be very welcoming to that because it's helping them make their decision. But what you're also doing is you're positioning your salesperson as a trusted advisor. So not just a product pusher, but a real expert in this area. And you're also tilting the playing field in a subtle way in your favor because you're framing up the business issues in a way that's favorable to your company. Next one.
So we're going to pause again for a quick poll question, and it's a pretty simple one. Do you align your content with your buying and selling cycles? And our panel has addressed a lot of different kinds of assets and tools that can be used to help customers make buying decisions and your salespeople to close deals faster. How have you done that alignment to the buying and selling cycle? Please use the polling box on the right-hand side. Be sure to hit submit, and we'll make sure we let you know the results over Twitter.
All right, step 5, the final step in the sales enablement and content process we here at Serious Decisions suggest to you all. This is the measurement phase of the process, and we see measurement mostly happening from a views and downloads perspective, some organizations don't even do views and downloads. So looking at it purely from a usage perspective is a good starting point. If we could move to the next slide. Also trying to get qualitative feedback from your reps through surveys, if you can create voting mechanisms on your portals, and trying to ascertain what are the high-value content, because usage only gives you directionally correct guidance in terms of looking at your content strategy. What we have here are the 4 stages of content maturity. So you can look at this slide and say, where's our organization today? Are we in the organized phase, the rationalized phase, align, or optimize? And if you're on the phone, you're probably somewhere more on the left than in the optimal part because you're done. And what does optimal mean? It means you're in content nirvana. Everything's inventoried. You know where everything is. It's on one content portal. It has multiple ways to access that content, highly sophisticated from a browse and search capability, strong, robust metadata. And you're also tying that content platform to your Salesforce automation tool, and there's integration so that you have visibility not only into what salespeople are using, but also when they're using it. So you begin to understand when these assets are being used in the sales process, which ultimately should indicate where those assets are being used in the buying process. So getting into these very predictive analytics in terms of your content. That's content nirvana. You also have a team, a committee, working together cross-functionally on a continuous basis to look at your content strategy. Once you've cleaned up that closet, if you don't keep it clean, it's going to be messy in another year. So this community of cross-functional content, the folks who really care about the content or are responsible for it in the organization are managing that closet and ensuring that it doesn't become a mess again.
And from a sales enablement perspective, just to build off of what Marisa just talked about, that ultimate, that nirvana, when we can actually align content and track it through our CRM application to see where it's being used, but not only where it's being used, but we've got clients who are able to track where content was used and whether or not it helped, drive a decision to a win. And we actually had one client share with us, it was pretty interesting, that they could actually correlate when the reps used a particular piece of content, they actually lost more. So that's a no-brainer. You get rid of that piece of content, you throw that out of the closet right away. But that's really, that's where we're getting to, where, we can now not only measure what they're using, where they're using it, but we can also begin to measure, where content's being used in those deals that our reps are winning. And then lastly, again, to kind of wrap the whole discussion around enablement, we've got clients who are also, certifying their reps on their ability to use a piece of content. So we've got talking with a client recently who has created basically a new elevator pitch for their reps, and it's designed to, it's got some strong messaging, it's designed to provoke their buyers, and they are working with their reps to certify them on how to deliver that PowerPoint presentation very precisely and very consistently across the field force.
And we feel very passionate about this because we see it work.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. When we see very elegant, highly leveraged sales enablement tools and content pieces that are really stellar, what's underpinning them is a thoughtful content strategy. The audit and mapping has been done and the filling in of the gaps, and it shows. So this actually does work. This really does contribute and eventually evolve the content creation activities you're doing into tools that definitely will help enable sales, and we're very confident will get used.
So if you're not yet in Nirvana, you're probably wondering if you have the resources to get started. And that's a common issue is that in these economic times, it's very difficult to just bring in another set of hands to help you with this. Know that the companies that have been the most successful were in a similar position to where you are right now. And they started small, and they started with a series of tangible, concrete goals. And here's 5 things that you can do right now, and these map to the topics that we talked about earlier. Number 1 is you can create a governance team right away. Get together a team of folks, a coalition from your sales operations, marketing, and other affected organizations, and get executive sponsorship and create a very simple charter and find an area to dig in and get started. And the second thing you could do along the lines of personas is to develop a couple basic key personas of some of your key selling and buying functions. So, for example, go out and talk to some of your field account executives and create a 2-page document that says, here's what the week in the life looks like for one of these folks. What are the key meetings they have? What are their key challenges? What are their key issues? And then share that with your marketing team or the team that's creating content. They'll appreciate the insight. Third is when you think about your inventory, don't forget about the criteria up front. You're going to eliminate a lot of finger pointing if you get everyone on the same page and how you figure out what good looks like. And as I mentioned before, we're going to be doing a brief later this week or next week to show you how to do that. Fourth is when you're aligning content to buying stages, identify one key stage and really zero in on that, and maybe identify 1 or 2 key tools to use for that stage. And then finally, come up with some simple metrics that you're going to use to track content effectiveness. And those can be things like downloads, but they could also be qualitative feedback from the field.
We're going to pause real quick to let you enter some questions for our panelists. We still have some time for Jim and Marisa and Jim to answer your questions. And while you're typing them in, just want to make sure you know about lots of tools and resources to help you along your journey. Launch International has some great content and information to give you some ideas on how to provide your sales teams content to have winning conversations. We have ebooks and our blog, as well as some great conversation going on over at the LinkedIn group, that's Sales Enablement Content. Also want to make sure you know how to get a hold of Jim and Marisa. They've been a big help for us today, answering some questions and having some great topics. We have their Twitter tags and their blog.SiriusDecisions.com. Always some great insight from the two of them and also the rest of the team at Sirius Decisions. I have gotten a few questions coming in, and I think the first one, folks, is for Jim and Marisa, and it sounds simple, but it's probably a biggie. Where exactly does content governance sit? Who owns it, and how do you manage it?
Sure. So content governance is a committee because obviously there are various stakeholders. There's sales communications or operations, and if you have a formal sales enablement function, they need to be involved. You have product marketing and solution marketing, who are the content creators. Many times we see them chairing the committee. If a sales enablement function isn't established in the organization, other times it might be sales enablement chairing the committee. It depends on the maturity of the organization from a sales enablement perspective. But many times it's product or solution marketing chairing that because they're the ones creating the content, and they want to ensure what's being merchandised to sales is being used. In addition, you also want to include marketing communications, those who are executing or actually not writing the content, but producing the tools and collateral, as well as selected either sales reps or some sales leaders who can really give some very tactical and actionable realistic coaching to the committee to help evolve the content strategy. And, of course, if you are a channel organization, you'll also want to involve your channel marketing folks as well.
Yeah, you'll also see on that committee sales training because you want to ensure that if you've implemented a sales methodology, that methodology has got to be baked into every communication you're sending out to your field force. And then, again, if you've got that enablement function, their role, as we had pointed out earlier, is to ensure that there's integration between all the groups, and also that they act as that filter to ensure that the reps aren't getting inundated with content get to the point where they can't drink out of the fire hose.
Yeah, in fact, sales training is a great contributor to the content strategy, even on specific assets, because they understand the methodology and the religion of the sales process, which typically on the product or solution side, they understand more the customer or the offering. Together, working together, when those folks are working together in a very tightly integrated fashion, you can really conceive some great sales tools.
Great. Thank you. From an operational standpoint, we will be putting this video and the presentation up on the Launch website, launchinternational.com. We'll have a slide on that in just a second as well. And the next question is for Jim Maliski at Launch International. Jim, lots of factors go into sales wins. How do you measure the effectiveness of sales enablement collateral?
Well, that's a great question because if you start, a lot of salespeople, rightly so, often take most of the credit for a sales win because they're instrumental in it. One of the things that a lot of clients are starting to do more of is that they're tracking content usage against for specific opportunities, against the success of those opportunities, and they're backing it up with interviews to try and gauge the effectiveness of it. The results on that, it's pretty early to really see if we can target specific ROI to specific pieces of content, and it's really a work in progress for a lot of different companies. One of the things you might want to consider also is if you think about doing your win-loss analyses and you go out and actually talk to your buyers, make sure that you include questions about the content itself in those win-loss analyses, right? So if you ask the buyer, what did you use as part of your consideration process? Did you go to our website and download content? Was it effective or not? You're going to be able to get a lot of great data there also.
Super. Our next question is actually a delivery question, and I think it's very interesting considering the number of media we have and a number of ways we can talk to our salespeople. And folks seem to be struggling with the right medium to get that content to the field. Doesn't seem like people are reading email anymore. There are social security issues with social media. What are some of the great ways you've seen to catch the attention of your field salespeople?
One of the recent interesting examples in use of technology was the use of a widget that could be downloadable and put on the salesperson's desktop, but the content was real-time and could be managed right from the content manager's desktop. So downloadable widgets were kind of cool, things that are very elegantly designed and very usable. So we're seeing real advances in terms of kind of the interface of content and folks getting very innovative in how that content is merchandised. Of course, I'll say that technology worked because there was a 2-year program prior to that to create the content strategy, do the audit mapping, and fill in the gaps. That really manifested itself in a beautiful technology implementation. The other way is to start thinking about mobile very differently, and this actually crosses sales content also into marketing campaigns and demand gen and awareness. Is mobile's on its way, and as marketers, we really have to figure out how we're going to leverage those technologies and move into that area. So we have a whole service area. It's a separate webinar. But I would suggest looking at mobile and putting a roadmap together in terms of how you make, especially iPads and these tablets, but also the phone in terms of content delivery, especially because when you're on a call, if you're a field rep, right, you're in the hallway, in your car, mobile's a great way to think about it.
Yeah, and I can just share with you an experience last week. I was in client meetings and able to use my recently acquired tablet computer, and it just changes the experience. It's just so different. The tactile interaction between you and the customer is just so different. But you also have to, I think the other thing we need to look at is the generation. So we've got millennials now coming in, playing a significant role both on the buying side and the sales side, and absolutely they don't. I've got a daughter who's in college. She doesn't look at her email. It's all text. So we need to look at new delivery modalities for that generation. They love video, so we're seeing clients who are moving to short, 30-second to 90-second videos where reps can find, just-in-time information that's delivered in a video format.
Right, and this gets right back to your personas of your sales organization. It's about defining those rep personas and understanding what are the technologies that they use to interface and do their job, and then supporting those.
And this is Jim. Also, the other Jim the Lesser. The other thing you might want to consider is talking to if you have a person in charge of field communications for your sales team. Often, a lot of companies have really popular, for example, sales newsletters or other ways that they reach out to the field. And if you're trying to promote content, that's a really great avenue also. So a weekly sales newsletter. One client we work with created a top 10 things you should know newsletter that was incredibly popular in the field.
Great. Thank you, Jim. By the way, we still have a few more minutes left. Still can take a few more questions if you have them. Marisa, you've mentioned several times, talked about content maps based on the persona of your salespeople. How deep do you go into the type of sellers? Do you get down even into a sales exec from a high level down to sales support, even more technical in the role of a sales engineer? Do you map that deeply with your enablement content?
The answer is yes, absolutely. So that's an excellent example is pre-sales engineer is one persona. A frontline sales manager is another persona. So a team manager, somebody who's managing a team, they're the agents of sales enablement. So they're coaching and mentoring the reps, and so thinking about them as a separate persona. And then the reps themselves, and you might categorize reps by their tenure, so taking reps who are not in their roles for more than 18 months to 2 years and put them in a new hire or freshman category. And for those 2 to 5, 7 years, and those plus 10 years, because they're going to have different needs,
right,
in terms of the kind of content that you need to produce for them and the kind of training that they need.
Yeah, and I think if you look at those personas, the sales engineer will needs the details that perhaps that frontline salesperson doesn't need, and also the audience because we think about our content is really the salesperson or the sales engineer is a conduit between our content and the customer. So you also want to look at who's that sales engineer going to be using that content with. It's going to be the technical buyer. Technical buyer wants to get into the weeds, wants the details, wants the technical specifications typically. So absolutely, you need to look at the personas across the sales organization, and also looking one level above in sales managers. What content do sales managers need in order to enable them to enable their field salespeople? And that's an audience that we see typically overlooked both from an enablement and a content perspective.
Great. Thank you very much. Next question I received, this one's actually for Jim Milisky. We have seen some of the early responses to the poll questions that we asked, and easily more than a third of the responders said that their content audits were suspect because they didn't include any seller interviews. Can you spend a minute talking about the audit process, the interview process, and how you make sure and justify recommendations for sales tools and assets?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really important point, because if you're, if you identify a series of steps and then go out to content owners and say, hey, just map your content to these different steps, you might feel like you're doing a really good job with your audit, but you're really not. You're not sort of having a subjective process, or you're not looking at that objectively. In other words, it's very easy for me to sort of sit at a table and say, okay, this fits here, this fits here, and this fits here, and just start kind of throwing content against a framework. And that's not the spirit of what a content audit is meant to do. You really have to allow people to map their content, but really evaluate that content based on whether it's really serving the needs of that sales stage. And so that's why seller interviews are so important, because they really are the customers for that content. And what you need to do is get their input, and show them specific examples. And here's another thing I've learned over the years. I've done well over 800 seller interviews, and if you ask salespeople sort of a general question about content, sometimes it's hard for them to wrap their arms around what the issues are. So one of the things that's been really effective is actually show them a couple samples. Right, so send them 3 or 4 different items and ask them a few questions, and then sort of show them the tools and say, is this what you're talking about when you say that the content doesn't speak to buyer needs? Here's a data sheet, and then you're able to get a lot more concrete feedback. The one challenge that you're going to run into when you're trying to get sales feedback is that salespeople's time is very carefully rationed because they're supposed to be out in the field driving revenue. So, what's probably realistic is to get about 45 minutes of a salesperson's time and talk to them over the phone, send them the content beforehand, and follow a really tightly scripted outline or discussion. The other thing is a lot of companies often do have some type of sales feedback board, and these are people that meet like on a quarterly basis, and they might spend a half a day in person talking about some of the key sales topics. So that's also another good venue to get feedback on content.
Great. Thank you for addressing that piece. And I think there's one final question from the audience, and it seems fitting to be our last one. We spent an awful lot of time talking about mapping the buying and selling cycle, and sort of a preview of that second poll question result. Easily, 3/4 of you out there are having a lot of questions, challenges around the documented buying process, the documented selling process, and trying to figure that whole piece out. And I think I would turn an open-ended question over to all three of you, starting with Jim and Marisa. If we don't have a great documented buying process or selling process, where can we start, and how do we get moving with this important topic of alignment to the sales and buying cycle?
Well, you can start with leveraging the Serious Decisions buying cycle framework. This is an industry standard framework, so it's an aggregated view. In many cases, in all cases, we have our clients validate that with their customers, and I've only seen one time where another stage was added. So it's definitely, from a B2B perspective, pretty spot on in terms of that. And then taking that buying cycle framework and then aligning that to your sales and mapping it to your existing sales process is the next step. And then finally taking that inventory and applying it to those stages.
Yeah, the framework, again, the framework, the beauty of the framework is it does work whether it's a 1 or 2 call close or it is a 6, 9, 12-month buying cycle. The buyers go through those phases typically. They're just going to go through them with different velocity, and also, the roles that people play and the actions that the buyers are taking will be slightly different. So the place to start is our framework, and then, what we encourage our clients to do is look for those observable outcomes from the buyer that indicate that the buyer is taking their next step in the journey. And that helps you then in building your sales process. You want to begin to incorporate some of that language in your sales process. But more importantly, as you're looking at how your reps are going to move deals through that sales process, it should be driven by those observable outcomes that we're seeing from the buyers. Because the reality is, and I learned this early in my sales career, I don't move the sales process along. The buyer does. The buyer does it because the buyer's moving their decision process along.
And the only thing I'd add to that is if you don't have a well-defined or formal sales process within your company, this is another good thing to do in your sales interviews, is to go out and ask an account executive just to walk you through a typical opportunity. Get them to describe the kinds of meetings they have, and what you'll find is that you'll very quickly figure out what a common process is. The one thing you do want to take into consideration, though, is a net new opportunity with a customer versus working with an existing account. You want to ask the salesperson who's doing both to walk you through both because they tend to be different. In other words, if I'm managing a major account relationship with an existing customer, ask them what a typical year looks like. What are some of the key meetings you have? If it's a net new customer, you have to ask them to walk you through the opportunity from start to finish.
Great. Thank you very much. We do want to thank all of our speakers, Marisa Kopec and Jim Ninivaggi, for their time and their expertise. and we want to thank all of you for attending. And let's try to keep this conversation going. I think we've established some great baselines for moving forward. We will tweet the results over on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and we will be posting this webinar, the presentation and the slides, over on our website, launchinternational.com. Again, thanks everybody very much for attending. We appreciate it, and have a great day.